Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to Utopian Horizons, a podcast where I cover a different utopia, dystopia, utopian thinker or movement in each episode. This includes film, fiction, literature, political movements, people, all kinds of other stuff. You can look back through the list of episodes to see the kind of stuff that I cover. Sorry that it's been a while since the last episode. That's for a number of reasons, but it's partly because of some changes that I'll be making to the podcast. You'll notice the new logo, if I've managed to update it properly so that it's showing up on iTunes, whatever else. I don't know, we'll see. Yeah, so you'll be noticing some differences over the next month or so, in that rather than doing the kind of episode a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, that I normally do, depending on how much time I have and how much time I have to put into the stuff I'm covering, there's going to be an episode roughly every week or so for about the next month, maybe slightly more, as well as additional bonus episodes in between those. So that's part of the reason that's been a while since the last episode, because it's taken me some time to prepare this stuff and get it ready. The reason I'm doing that, because obviously this isn't a schedule that I'm usually able to keep up. I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but so sorry if you've heard me say this before, but some people may not have heard me say it. A lot of time goes into each episode, so they usually entail me, for example, having to read a book. I take notes on the book, I write up some thoughts on that. I sometimes do additional reading around the book. I have to find guests, I have to arrange the interviews, I have to do interviews, edit the podcast. I put many hours into each episode that I do, which is why it often takes me a bit of time to get them up. But I would like to have a more regular schedule. I'd like to put out episodes regularly, like I'm going to be doing over this next few weeks. So the extent to which I'm going to be able to keep up that kind of schedule or get closer to that is going to depend on you and your support, which ties into the other changes I'm going to be making, which is to the podcast's Patreon. Most of you probably know what Patreon is, but if you don't, it's a thing where you sign up to give someone a certain amount of money a month to support whatever they're doing, and you can cancel wherever you want or change the amount whenever you want and all that stuff. So as it stands, my Patreon has just been there for people that want to give me a bit of cash to help me out. There's not been any kind of specific reward for that as above and beyond what, the podcast that I produce. And I'm very grateful to those of you who are already supporting me on that. So yes, thank you very much for that. But it's become pretty obvious to me that most Patreons obviously offer people stuff for the money that they contribute, and I feel like that's something I have to try doing if I'm going to sort of persuade more of you to sign up and help me to keep doing this. So the standard episodes, I'm going to keep producing those. They're going to keep being free to everybody, but I will be producing bonus episodes for those of you that sign up for $5 a month, which means I'm basically, as it stands, I'll be producing bonus episodes for like one person, but I'm hoping that a few more of you will be interested in that and sign up for that. So the first one will be out either now when you're hearing this or in the next few days, which is an episode on utopia and music. So I've got quite a few people I've had on for previous episodes talking about a song and its relationship to utopia. So I've got Darren Anderson, who was on my Cities and Architecture episode, Anna McFarlane, who's been on the podcast twice to talk about Neuromancer and Strange Days, Sean McTiernan, who's also been on twice to talk about Nemesis and Kamikaze 89, Adam Roberts, who you might be familiar with from his science fiction novels. He was also previously on the podcast to talk about H.G. Wells' A Modern Utopia. I've also got David Bell, who hasn't been on the podcast before, so this will be the first time he's on. Have I mentioned everyone that's on there? I hope so. I've also got like another bonus episode already recorded, and yeah, that'll be ongoing, so I'll continue to be releasing those. I'm also getting some nice little Utopian Horizons badges, or like pins, I guess you'd call them if you're American, at the $2 tier. But yeah, anyway, you can go and look and see all that on patreon.com/Utopian Horizons. I'd really appreciate it if you could just think about maybe supporting me to do this, because it is quite difficult for me to do this podcast in terms of like time and my. Again, I've mentioned this before, so sorry to bore you, but I am self-employed. I'm freelance. I am, I suppose, a precarious worker in that sense, which means that time I spend on the podcast is time that I could spend earning money, and that's quite difficult in itself. So, yeah, I'd really like to be able to get into a position where I could get a bit of money in for this podcast, so that I could that would justify me to put more time into it and keep up a more regular schedule. So yeah, that's what's happening there. I'm hoping that the next month or so will kind of show you what I'd like this podcast to be, how it could be. I'm hoping that some of you will come to support me and make that sustainable and help me to keep doing it, but we'll see how it goes. In any case, if you sign up for the $5 tier, I'm going to be producing bonus episodes for you, so that's going to happen, whatever. So, yeah, I have no idea what the response to this will be like. But yeah, as I say, I appreciate if you could just go to patreon.com/Utopian Horizons and think about just slinging, the price of, probably not even like the price of a beer a month or whatever, my way for the work that I put into this and to make this sustainable, to keep going and more regular and so on. Right, you probably don't want to hear me ramble about that and beg anymore, so I will move on. Also, just on my constant beggings for iTunes reviews every episode, I noticed that a couple of you did give me iTunes reviews, so that's appreciated as well. Actually, while I'm on that, while I'm putting out all these episodes, like the next month or so, that would be a really good time for reviews to help sort of boost the profile of the podcast and get more people listening while there's more stuff coming out. So if you've been thinking, I will write a review at some point, now would be a really good time. So yeah, reviews on iTunes would be appreciated as well. Right, this episode is a book I've been meaning to do for ages. It's about The Dispossessed, written by Ursula Le Guin, who I've mentioned briefly on the podcast before, when she passed away recently, who is, I think, a kind of unashamed utopian, a great science fiction writer and a great utopian writer. So joining me on this episode to talk about the book is Sarah Lohmann from the University of Durham. She's working on feminist utopias, which ties in nicely to some of the things of this book. You can find her on Twitter at Sarah Lohmann if you want to have a look on there. Lohmann spelled Lohmann. And I would just say that this episode is quite a long conversation, so I've divided it into two parts. So this is part one of our conversation about The Dispossessed, and in roughly a week I'll be releasing part two. So you got that to look forward to. And then, as I said, new schedule. There'll be another one like a week or so after that. Amazing. So yeah, glad to finally be back with an episode. Please think about checking out the Patreon. And here is my conversation with Sarah. Joining me now is Sarah Lohmann. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Durham, working on feminist utopias. Thank you very much for joining me, Sarah.
Sure.
So we are going to be talking today about Ursula Le Guin's 1974 novel, The Dispossessed, with the subheading An Ambiguous Utopia. Before we get into it, I'll try and give a bit of setup of the novel for anyone who's not familiar with it or people who might need a bit refreshing. So this is a book about two different worlds, the worlds of Anarres and Anarres. Anarres is a capitalist society that's fairly similar to ours. It's pretty obviously meant to mirror the society that we have on Earth. Anarres is an anarchist society founded by Odonians, or the followers of the teachings of Odo. And they were allowed to leave Anarres hundreds of years ago to kind of avert a revolution that was happening there. They were allowed to go to the moon of Anarres, which is now Anarres, and start their own anarchist society. So this book is told from the perspective of Shevek, who's a physicist on Anarres. It was kind of weird to call someone by a job role on that planet, which perhaps we'll explain a bit more about later. And through him, we learn about these two worlds cutting between his past, where his life story on Anarres, that's how we learn about that society, and the present, in which he's a visitor to Anarres, the first visitor from Anarres since the society was formed. I thought the first place we should start is talking about the features of Anarres as a utopia. I think we might get onto the ways that that's complicated perhaps later on. But I just wondered if you could try and give us a brief overview of what this society is and kind of how it's structured.
Yeah, so Anarres is the moon of Eros, and they've had 150 years to set up this anarcho-communist society based on the teachings of Odo, like you said. But actually, Odo herself never got to experience this society because she died before they ever really settled Anarres. So it's entirely an ideological social experiment that's already quite mature because it's been running for 150 years. So it's a really interesting entry point, I think, for the reader to arrive at, because we're not witnessing the setting out of a new society. We're witnessing a society that's already established, but quite different from its parent society, and we have this immediate comparison between the two. So, like you were saying, that Eros is supposed to be similar to our own world, but I just wanted to say as well that our own world is actually, of course, also in the universe. Yeah. So there's Terra, which is a future version of our world, and we do actually later on in the story meet an ambassador from Terra. So that's a really interesting comparison as well, because she tells us what has happened to that planet, and her opinion is quite interesting there. Her perspective is interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, as you mentioned, kind of broadly speaking, like anarchist or communist. So there's no government or authority technically. Like people are allowed to organize themselves into like syndicates, which I guess you would broadly describe as like a cooperative or something.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that a lot of that stuff, the way we see it, it's like built into the culture of Anarres. Like we see Shivak as a baby. He's been taught like nothing is yours. Like, oh, Shivak, you know you can't have things. Quite interesting, I felt, the way it's kind of, you see it built into the culture.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole anarcho-communist society of Anarres is based on the writings of people like Kropotkin and Lao Tzu and Paul Goodman. And so these are all kind of philosophers and anarchist philosophers and thinkers who kind of were embraced by anti-authoritarian movements. Yeah, and Kropotkin in particular wrote a lot on anarcho-communism. So basically, Le Guin is just this is her imagination of what an anarcho-communist society would maybe look like in its purest form. So you're absolutely right. So it's about looking at how it would organize itself into groups that still, or systems that still run things to a certain extent, but doing all of that without any kind of hierarchy, or at least not on purpose. It's not supposed to be there. Like, there are still little hierarchies that develop, but in principle, it should be a flat society without a government. And so the main principles, I think, that she's trying to realize here are what you could maybe see as like the three great enemies of freedom. So there's like the state, there's organized religion, and there's private property. And so none of those really exist here. And instead, the whole society is based on the principle of mutual aid. But of course, like, they do, this is complicated. So in the text. So, for example, like, there are these, we'll get to this later, there are these hierarchies that do establish themselves that are not intended, that are based on like individuals wanting power or being afraid of things. And then there is also, to a small extent, there is private property, but really only just people, picking up things here or there, or making something very small and maybe taking it with them for a while. But even when they do that, like, you can definitely tell that there's just not that attachment there. Like, they're not defining themselves at all through what they own.
So stuff like, yeah, they have, like, Shivak, is it Shivak?
I don't know. I think of him as Shevik, but whatever.
Shevak, sorry.
I think I'm mispronouncing most of these terms, so it doesn't really matter.
I don't know. So Shevak, for example, has like an orange blanket that he feels guilty about having. So like, it's never much stuff. But things like housing is completely free. You just, if you go to like a new town, you just go to like an office of some kind and sign up, and you could just move in.
Yeah.
So they tend to be like dormitory spaces, although you can also have like private spaces if you're in like a partnership, which is their equivalent of marriage.
Yeah, although that is also, like, partnerships are recognized to a certain extent, but then, of course, you they also make it clear that established partners do struggle sometimes with being posted to different places. So it's not like it's not automatically something that is accommodated in the system. It's something that might be accommodated, but nothing is guaranteed. Like, it's all just about the individual and what is needed in society at that point in time in terms of what they do. So usually they can follow their interests in terms of basically what job they have, but that takes a backseat to fulfilling the exact role that the society needs at times of crisis in particular. So, for example, if there's a drought and the planet is very prone to drought because it's just very barren and doesn't grow very much, it has a very harsh climate, then people are posted to positions where they'll have to be in a very particular job, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, so that kind of highlights that. You've already mentioned that, like, collectivity is very important in this society. Like, individual freedom is there, but people, like, the social obligation is always there as well. So yeah, as there's that balance there, as you say, in times of disaster, people tend to aren't forced to, they kind of they have it inbuilt to them. They owe a debt to other people, so they will do difficult work and go where they're needed. But generally speaking, like in times of non-crisis, you can do what you want. Like, in terms of work, you can go where you want. They say that so efficiency is not important at all. And well, no, I wouldn't say not important at all, but they don't organise themselves around efficiency in the way that capitalist society would, or a neoliberal society would. They move around jobs a lot. Everybody does dangerous jobs, undesirable jobs. So they usually do it for like 6 months or so, which obviously isn't that efficient because you're always getting new people, like, learning what they've got to do. But that's not the most important thing in this society most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's also interesting is that people take on, for example, manual labor, and they would never look down on a particular kind of work because they all do these different kinds of work at different times. So you would never have a situation where someone, for example, has a particular kind of education and then would look down on people who perform manual labor and wouldn't do it themselves. So there's very much just this idea that a society requires certain things to function, and everyone just pitches in and does those things. And even if you have a career within a certain field, for example, as Shevik does as a physicist, like, you're never too good for any other kind of work as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's very egalitarian in that sense too, that no job is better than another job, and then ideally also then within, for example, the academic communities, that they do have, technically no one is above anyone else, and everyone just kind of works together. Although in practice, of course, it doesn't quite always work out like that. But that's the idea behind it.
One other thing on work I thought was interesting. It's kind of, so you can do what you want, but there's kind of people also. It's also managed by like a computer system.
Yeah.
So people would tend to like put themselves into the pool and the system, say, I'm ready to do, or I'd like to do this type of work, or I'm ready to do any type of work, whatever you want. And the computer is meant to be standing as like a neutral system. It just made me think of like how Silicon Valley people view like computer systems as like the solution for everything now, which perhaps makes that look a bit naive now. I don't know. Like this idea that computers are inherently neutral.
Yeah, no, definitely. But you can tell that they've kind of just done their best to outsource this decision making to, well, basically, you know, if it was a more modern utopia, it might be an AI or something like that. But like they're definitely doing their best to just like take out this element of people choosing things for other people. So it's just they're trying to make it as automatic and kind of random as possible. And of course, then you have that with personal names as well, that those are chosen by a computer, and then they only have one name, right? They don't have a first and a last name, and there's only ever one person alive with a particular name, so you don't have any confusion there. And that's interesting because, to my mind, of course, you know, I would see that as not part of being really free as an individual to just be given a name, but at the same time, that is actually a very efficient system, I think, and it is completely impersonal, and no one can complain. And also, again, there's absolutely no stigma attached to having any particular kind of name. There's no indication that you come from a particular social background. There's no indication that you're a certain age. There's all of that just doesn't apply. Like, they're literally just ways to identify people. And it's just, I guess, a more personal way of they could also be using numbers, but it's just slightly more personal than that.
Now, obviously, we already mentioned you're working on like feminist utopias. Would you say that it's fair to call this society like feminist or equal, or however you'd want to?
Yeah. So I work on feminist utopias like Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time and Joanna Russ's The Female Man, and I'm actually also including The Dispossessed in my analysis now, given that it's so basically the novels that I mentioned, along with The Dispossessed, and also Samuel Delaney's Triton, or Turbo on Triton, they're all seen as, they're officially categorized as critical utopias by Tom Moylan, and all of them have in common, well, maybe Triton to a lesser extent, so I'm not actually including it in my analysis, but the other three definitely have a society that is basically, that has basic equality between the genders, and or between the sexes, and that's a really important element of what makes these societies utopian. So what Tom Moylan says is that they are able to be very critical of our own world, in that they address all the kind of social inequalities and difficulties that we currently have because we haven't sorted out social justice. And so basically he says that they're very useful utopian imaginings because they actually address what's wrong in our current world. They don't just kind of explore what would be nice to have. So like some traditional utopias from maybe like the turn of the century, the fin de siècle, like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, or William Morris's News from Nowhere, they see themselves as socialists, but they kind of just they make an attempt at creating more or less equal societies as part of their socialism, but they don't really ever do it from the perspective of those people who would need a utopia, those people who are currently marginalized. And so it ends up actually being a very unequal system in those cases. And what the critical utopias do is they very much pay attention to equality, and they very much just have these very equal societies in the end. And so yeah, I would definitely call this a feminist utopia. What's different about this one compared to Woman on the Edge of Time and The Female Man is that the main protagonist is a man. And that's actually something that Tom Moylan criticizes in Demand the Impossible. So he thinks it's not quite as feminist a book as it thinks it is. But I think I would maybe agree that maybe some of the female characters in the story aren't quite as don't play as big a role as they could maybe, but at the same time, it is absolutely the case in the society that women are absolutely equal to men. And I also think that equality, especially equality between the sexes, is a very major difference that Shevik notices between Anarres and then Eurus when he visits. So that's something that we're made very aware of, that he asks explicitly, he asks his doctor on the journey over about women in their society, and he just learns very quickly that women are just completely marginalized on Eurus, or just aren't even able to have certain jobs, and are also just exploited and wear clothing that's very kind of objectifying, and definitely aren't allowed to be part of the scientific community, and which is of course a big deal for Shevik. So the feminism of Anarres and the sexism of Eurus is a major point in the book.
Yeah, I think that's one of the first thing he mentions or notices when he gets there as well, to the university. Like so as you say, so on his world, obviously he says there's no distinction between men's work and women's work, and people do what they want according to their strengths, their talents, what they're interested in. And he says to the doctor, what's sex got to do with that? There's machines to compensate for strength. Like we have those, that doesn't matter. But it's quite an effective question. Like I think he asks like, where are all the women? Like when he's at the university, which is quite an effective question, not just for us as the reader as well, because we might be used to reading books where all the characters are men, and we might be used to an educational context where if you've been to university in things like physics or computer science quite often tend to be dominated by men. So it's something that you might not even notice as you're reading the book. And his questions like, where are all the women? Like it's something that you might not have clocked onto with the reader as well, if you know what I
Oh,
mean.
absolutely. Yeah. So it's very estranging to see Eurus through Shevik's perspective because he not only does he have this very different background, but he also is just because they speak very clearly on Anarres. Like their language, Pravik, is very direct, and they also have this very direct attitude. So he has absolutely no qualms, just like asking very directly, like, "Where are all the women? Like, what's going on here? Like, I find this weird." Like he doesn't have any kind of notion of politeness that he wouldn't bring that up. So it's a very good way of kind of just pointing out those differences in within the narrative. And I just wanted to say as well, in terms of Anarres being very egalitarian. So of course Odo founded Anarres, so that in itself I think is already like, you know, the protagonist is male, fair enough, but at least everything that he believes in and that he knows and that he ends up really supporting is based on the writings of a female academic. And then also I think what's really central to the feminism of the utopian society, which you also get in things like Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time and Joanna Russ's The Female Man, is that women aren't burdened by for example, childcare responsibilities that are often kind of unacknowledged even in other utopias, where even in other utopias that try to be in some way egalitarian, they often still make childcare and child rearing and childbirth all very much the domain of women. And here it's made very clear that so there's no kind of, sometimes there's this technology that you might have, breeding technology like Woman on the Edge of Time, or, you know, like, and men breastfeed children there as well. So there's all sorts of ways of doing things differently on a biological level. But here it's just on the level of the society that children very quickly leave the parental home and sleep in dormitories and just automatically just have this very comprehensive education that is also in itself gender neutral. So they do all sorts of things that prepare them for the real world, but that is not in any way linked to what gender they are. So so it might sound like a very small thing, but I think that is one element that really just opens up societal participation for both men and women in this utopia.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting element, actually, because I think a lot of the stuff in this society would generally be like someone who's like on the left or tends to be more to the left would be quite open to a lot of this stuff. I suspect people might be a bit like the way that families and childcare is dealt with. I feel like some people might be a bit more unsure about that element because, as you say, the children are tend to be out of the parents' hands quite early. Like it's to do. Also, they have this very open idea towards like, so that their word for mum or dad in their language is applicable to like any adult. Like they don't necessarily have a dad. They could refer to multiple male people that perform a kind of parent role as dad.
Yeah, tade, isn't it? Is the word, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, yeah.
And like being the protagonist that we're talking about, we see that he has a much closer relationship with his father than his mother, so that's kind of the first sign that it's perhaps more equal. But yeah, most children go into these, like, I suppose, like a part dormitory, part school, as you said, quite early, and I feel people might be a bit less like open to that, like the children not growing up with you.
Well, I think so what I initially, when I read The Dispossessed for the first time, I liked the idea of just like exploring an anarchist society in detail. But the one thing that, and I always kind of think about utopias in terms of, oh, would I want to live there, you know? And the one thing that actually really put me off was was their living situations. So yeah. I really don't think that I would want to spend basically my whole life living in shared housing where even if you're a couple or a family, you basically have to share a room. And it's just all very basic. And I also like my little creature comforts and just, you know, having like, you know, nice furnishings and things, but also just the fact that you just, you basically just give up your children to society very early on. And, but I think it's an interesting one because, so, you know, even if it's a bit later, like in most societies, like people do actually send their children to school at a similar age. Like maybe they'll still be living at home, but then again, in the UK, for example, there are boarding schools, and so I think that's not actually that different from our society. And also what you have to keep in mind, I think, as well, is that like with all of these conventions on Anarres, like it's made explicit over and over again that you can choose not to participate. And
yeah, sure.
you can choose to, for example, build your own house somewhere and just live there and still participate in society in whatever way you want to. Like it's all open to you. It's just that it's easiest for people to basically, conform to the system and in these various ways. And, at some point, even at the very end, Takver, Shevik's partner, suggests that, if things go very badly for them, they could always just move away from town and form their own little anarchist community within Anarres. So that is also absolutely an option. So none of these things you really have to conform to. Or at one point, Shevik's daughter gets bullied because of her because what her father has been doing, and he's seen as a traitor. And they decide to just take her out of the dormitory. So that's fine. And no one would say that they can't do that. There's nothing you can't do. The only rebuke that you would get is to have people basically frown on you, on your actions. That's the only thing that can happen.
Yeah, with the I think you're right with the living situation, because I also would not like to spend all my time in these shared dormitories and stuff. But I think that's something I quite like about the book. It's quite provocative in terms of thinking. Yeah. It's kind of saying look, this is a collective society, a shared society where that's all embedded on a cultural level, a natural level. Yeah. So that is necessarily the idea is if you want this kind of collective society, maybe you will have to deal with this if you see what I mean.
But also, I think, absolutely. So it's a decision that they've made communally to begin with. Although, of course, none of the people living there at this point in time were alive when that communal decision was made. But they're still choosing to stick to it. And I wanted to get back to this later, but they're sticking to this promise that Odo made to begin with, that they would promise each other to live communally and respect each other as a community and make that work. And they've just chosen to go along with that all of these years. And so the only way that they're, that they kind of enforce that is by just basically criticizing people who egoize, or, that's what they, that's the term they use for people who are acting in a way that seems selfish or not for the benefit of the community. And but because I think they've just made this decision, and they just and they think it's something that's worth it's a principle that's worth living by because it's so valuable. I think they get into these habits that actually probably wouldn't even be that difficult to maintain if that's what you grew up with. So, for example, this, just not holding on to personal possessions. I think that, it looks really harsh to, look at how they live in these small cramped rooms and they, barely own anything. But then if you think about it, maybe the room wouldn't be seen as small and cramped if actually you don't have stuff to fill it. And maybe, if you value community above selfishness, then maybe it would make you quite happy to have people right next door. And that would be more important to you than to have a little bit more space. And also, if you just never got used to owning things and dragging them along with you, then you might really value being able to move quickly, for example, over holding on to certain belongings. And I think actually you mentioned the orange blanket earlier.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really nice little symbol for, or not a symbol, but a little recurring indicator of how they think about possessions. So it's kind of like we as readers get a little bit attached to this orange blanket because it kind of is, it's like the one bit of home furnishing that Shevik actually owns, and he takes it with him. It's the only thing that he kind of holds on to. And then at the very end, he doesn't bring it with him. I think in the end, when he again moves in with his partner, And she says, and she asks him where it is, and she's actually a bit sad, and she says, "Oh, it's the first blanket that we slept under together." And he says, "Oh no, there was probably a different one, and it doesn't really matter." And I think that's actually quite nice, because like even that one thing that we've been holding on to as readers, as like his one possession, even that is gone. But then we see that it was important to attack for, because it in some way she associated it with their relationship. But without that object, all we have left to focus on is their relationship. And that's kind of nice. Again, it's just like this, again, it's just made clear that it's all about relationships. It's all about what we do together and how we act towards other people, rather than like what we surround ourselves with.
Yeah, sure. So I want to ask you something that you mentioned to me when we were emailing these, that you were working on. Something you're working on with feminist utopias is feminist utopias with complexity theory. I Googled it, I don't really understand what it is. So perhaps you could explain a bit about that and how that relates to this.
Yeah, totally. So again, Anarres is an equal society, right? On paper, that's how it functions. Is that people, the basic setup is that everyone is equal, and everyone also takes on different jobs at different points in time to help the society function, right? And there is no hierarchy, there is no top-down government. It's all bottom-up. It's just completely flat, right? Mm-hmm. And okay, so in my thesis, I was looking at a few of these feminist utopias, like the ones I mentioned before, and I was thinking about how they are able to kind of really like model a better egalitarian society in a way that's not static, but actually dynamic and sustainable. And I noticed both in the Dispossessed as well, in terms of the narrative structure, but also especially in Woman on the Edge of Time and The Female Man, that there's actually a lot going on the level of the narrative structure, in terms of there's a lot of time travel, there's a lot of jumping back and forth, and also the utopias themselves aren't just like straightforwardly perfect. Also, they're not guaranteed in the future. They maybe won't necessarily happen. They're maybe like on a strand of probability that may or may not come about. And I was just thinking about why it's all so kind of torn up in that way, why you've got so much movement. And I was talking about this with my supervisor, and we were talking about systems theory, and she brought up complexity theory. And then I realized that actually one way of understanding both this kind of very kind of disrupted structure and also the inherent dynamism of these societies is by seeing them or reading them as examples of complex adaptive systems. And those are like described by complexity theorists like Mark C. Taylor or Paul Cilliers or Ilya Prigogine. These are systems that have lots of different elements to them that all work together, and but they're always open and in a state of constant adaptation. And they're also like completely flat, so no one's running them. They just run themselves. They're self-organizing and self-optimizing, so they will always tend towards the best possible system of interaction. And but they're not just complicated in that they have lots of elements. They're actually complex in that their interactions can't be understood just by analyzing the components. So you couldn't like slice through it or kind of pause the system and understand it by looking at it in that way. Like it can only ever be understood as something that is already in motion, that's always changing. So what's really interesting to me about complex adaptive systems is that they are necessarily always dynamic, in that they're balanced at a point that's called either far from equilibrium or at the edge of chaos, where this drive happens, where there's always this shift and change towards self-organization. So they cannot be static, because if they were static, they would die. They just couldn't survive. So it's very much kind of non-linear behavior. It's unpredictable, but it's dynamic, and because it's dynamic, it's sustainable. Oh wait, here there's a good quote on this point, far from equilibrium, that I mentioned. So Cilliers says, "A self-organizing system will try to balance itself at a critical point between rigid order and chaos, which he calls the point of criticality," and that's where it forms itself, where it keeps kind of dynamically developing. Yeah, and also So on the one hand, this is really interesting for an egalitarian society, like as a model for trying to understand an egalitarian society, because a complex system has to be completely flat for different, so that because it works through feedback relations, right? And so certain relations establish themselves between different elements in the system, and if they work, then they're reinforced, and if they don't, then that connection just drops. And the different elements take on different roles depending on where the feedback relations are particularly strong or where new ones need to be created. And but this taking on of new roles can only happen if it's already a flat system, right? So if you had a hierarchy, then that would be too rigid. Then you wouldn't be able to get that element from a point higher up to elsewhere. So it has to be completely flat already. And then also, it's not just so the difference between that and a homeostatic system, like for example a thermostat that's just trying to maintain balance. So that in itself would also be a form of rigidity, right? If it was just a system that was in motion but not really going anywhere, so just kind of just balancing itself out constantly, that's not sustainable, because that's not reacting to change, that's not incorporating change. And instead, I think a utopian complex system also has positive feedback relations, in that these relations amplify tendencies and produce change. So you've got certain feedback relations that, because they're just allowed to happen within the system, they might very well produce something, produce the kind of unpredictable emergence of something that just wasn't anticipated, but that happens to be part of the system and help the system work better. And that's just then part of how it works. But it's just, again, like it's unpredictable. But because this kind of change is already incorporated, it's not going to disrupt the system. It's only going to make it stronger. So, for example, like I was saying that in terms of having an egalitarian and feminist society, that, for example, Woman on the Edge of Time has breeding technology. So I'd say that is an example of something that's completely new that has emerged from the utopian feedback relations in the society. And it's not necessarily something that the people of the society wanted or planned for or anything. It just happened because it works well for that society, and then it's part of that utopia. And so, for example, the Ansible, so this instantaneous communication system that is developed later on based on Chevik's work in physics and temporality, that I would say is one of these unexpected emergent properties of this utopia that reacts to change, and but then is very much part of this world because that's what the system called for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. No, it's interesting, both. So this idea that egalitarianism is necessarily built into these complex systems, but also it's inherently utopian, right? Because if you think of a utopia having to be dynamic and open to change, then, which I think is what a utopia would be, always able to incorporate and evolve, adapt to change, and that's obviously what a complex system can do. And I think the book in what it's telling you about Anarres almost suggests that it's Shevak, sorry, however you pronounce his name. What he's doing is disruptive to the society, and being some people are resisting it, and it's kind of a question about whether he talked about a system that's just trying to maintain balance. So there's a kind of question of whether Anarres is just going to try and retain balance, or whether Shevak is going to be able to do what he's trying to do, and the society is going to be open to change and remain like a complex system, I guess you would say.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think homeostasis is also definitely part of the system. For example, this posting system that they have through their general PDC, is it? That's explicitly called homeostatic, and that's just trying to kind of maintain a balance of where people are working at what point in time, and so that's absolutely part of it, and that's kind of how the society survives. But the only way it can be utopian is by also having these positive feedback relations, and Shevek himself is absolutely part of that. So he kind of symbolizes the emergence of the genuinely new and the genuinely utopian. And so the fact that he's trying to still be part of society and move society forward himself is is indicative of his role as this positive utopian force within the system that has to be incorporated for the system to survive. So by excluding people like Shevik and his work, that is how Anarres could cease to to work at all, and certainly not to exist as a utopia. So there's this constant thing about it already being attempting to be utopian, but then also needing to incorporate change and draw on change and make that part of its reality in order to survive, in order to progress. So that's really, I think, the core of what the role that Shevik plays and that he sees himself as playing. I just wanted to say, sorry, he also, just in terms of Anarres as a complex system, so he also says things like that coercion is the least efficient means of obtaining order. So it's very much this, so that's him comparing Anarres to Eurus. So it's very much this idea that you can, not only is it, nice for the people involved to have a society that is equal and that has a way of functioning in which people can more or less choose what they want to do, but it's also the most efficient way of doing things, because it's not kind of held back by these arbitrary walls that people build for whatever reasons, for personal selfish reasons, or because they want to control other people, etc. And then ultimately, the ideal is that you have this system that's alive. So the Terran ambassador later on, she says that from a Terran perspective, she sees Eurus as alive, but it's not compared to the genuine sustainable dynamism of somewhere like Anarres. So at one point, I think Shevik is talking about the PDC meetings and how he says it's more of a slab of raw beef compared to a wiring diagram. But then he says, but raw beef functions better than a wiring diagram would in its place, which is inside a living animal. So again, even though it might be a process that's that might take a little bit longer, or you were saying earlier, it might not be super efficient in that people take on different jobs and maybe need to be trained every time, etc. It's still alive. It's still, at least it's not rigid. It's able to sustain itself dynamically because of the way that it's set up, even if that means paying for it in terms of efficiency within particular sections.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an interesting little quote there.
Yeah, sure. So one of the other things you mentioned was temporality in this, or utopian times. So what was that aspect of it then?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's this really interesting link that's I think also just really central to this book between anarchy and how that works on Anarres, and then also Shevik's work in physics, which is about temporality, and I think both of those kind of come down to dynamism and complexity, and just understanding how something can function, does and can function in a way that is holistically understood and self-sustaining. And there's also this idea of permanent revolution that that underlies the anarchism of Anarres. And I think that to a certain extent, Shevik personifies that revolution with his ideas in physics, and his work in physics can be seen as kind of both a parallel, a metaphor for what's happening in terms of the politics of Anarres versus Eurus, and also the two literally kind of his ideas on anarchy and his ideas on physics literally support each other and reinforce each other. So so I just wanted to talk about that briefly, if that's okay. Okay, so just as a background, bit of background information, Shevik is working on, while the story happens, he's working on a general temporal theory that combines two different ways of looking at time. So there's sequency physics and there's simultaneity physics. So the one sees time as something that kind of just moves forward, and that moves from the past through the present to the future, and the other sees time as kind of already existing and being real, like every point in time already being real. And yeah, so he actually describes it as, so sequency could be seen as like a rock being thrown, moving from the past again to the future. And then, but then he already as a child, he kind of realizes why, this is the dominant theory in physics in both on Anarres and Eurus at this point in time. But even when he's quite young, he realizes that that's not really that can't really work, because so, for example, if a rock is thrown, it can never really reach the tree because of Zeno's paradox, that it only ever, gets within a certain period of time, it'll get like halfway to the tree and then halfway again and then halfway again. So it'll never actually reach the tree. Yeah. And so basically, for most of his adult life, then Shevek has been working on this simultaneity theory of time. And he describes it to some people on Eurus as like reading a book, where you time is the book and we're reading it, but we can only ever see a part of it. We can only read one page of it at a time, but it's still already all there to begin with. So again, he explains on Eurus that sequency explains our sense of linear time and evolution as well, and it includes creation and mortality, but it can't explain why things also endure. It can't explain the circle of time. Then they ask him about what the circle of time is, and he says, well, time goes in cycles as well as in a line. He says, a planet revolving, you see, one cycle, one orbit around the sun is a year, and 2 orbits 2 years, and so on. You can count the cycles endlessly, and that's in fact how we count time. But within the system, the cycle, where is time? Where is the beginning or end? Infinite repetition is an atemporal process. And later he says, so it's actually the tiny time reversible cycles of the atom that give matter enough permanence that evolution is possible. So you can only have the linearity of time if you also have these cycles of time. He says the little timelesses added together make up time. Only within each of the great cycles where we live, only there is there linear time, evolution, and change. So basically he says that time has these two aspects. There's the arrow, the running river, within which there is no change, no progress or direction or creation, and there's the circle or the cycle, without which there is chaos, meaningless succession of instants, a world without clocks or seasons or promises. Promises is a word that I'm going to come back to, but I think he nicely kind of sets out these two ways of looking at time. But then the crux of his career is where he realizes, is his general temporal theory, where he realizes that both of those are necessary to our understanding of time, and we can only understand time if we take on both of these ways of seeing it. And and actually there's a paper called Embodied Anarchy in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed that kind of nicely explains that in terms of the logic of complementarity. So Daniel Jekyll, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, he says that he compares this, like these two ways of seeing one thing, to, for example, the rabbit duck drawing, that, if you look at it one way, it looks like a rabbit. If you look at it a different way, it looks like a duck. Yeah. But he says that is what complementarity is. So the use of two seemingly incompatible perspectives in order to see the wholeness of some slice of reality. And so he says that that's a particular form of containing difference within unity. And so he says its power rests on its ability not to diminish the integrity of either interpretation, but bring both ways of seeing into a whole. And so you're missing something if you only look at this particular thing in one way, even though you can't necessarily understand both ways of seeing whatever it is at one point in time. They're still both absolutely necessary for a deeper understanding of whatever it is. And so then in Shevek's work, this applies to time itself. So he has this realization that both of these viewpoints are necessary, both sequency and simultaneity. And he says that is, he uses the concept of interval to connect the static and the dynamic aspects of the universe. And he says, there would be no trouble in going there at all. Indeed, he had already gone on. He was there. And so this is this nice kind of realization that he has, that it's not, again, like that he's already that, like, all times exist concurrently. So he's both within a point where he has, along a linear sequence of events, arrived at a point where he has made this discovery, but also it was already there because all times already exist. So he's kind of like suddenly locating himself at this point in time that combines both linearity and cyclicality, and then he has a sense of wholeness. So it says, the wall was down, the vision was both clear and whole. What he saw was simple, simpler than anything else. It was simplicity, and contained in it all complexity, all promise. It was revelation. So again, it's this essential dynamism, and it's literally the complexity of reality in which things work together in a particular way without coercion, because that's how they interlink. And there's also a paper by Teresa Taormina where she points out that the fact that he's looking for a unified general theory of time is also can be seen as a metaphor for unity, working together, communication, and the complexity underlying that. Again, so this idea of wholeness and of coming together and of seeing the world as it really is, but also this kind of moral sense of everyone playing a part in reality, and especially in how a society should be run. Sorry, that's a lot just now.
That's okay. That's kind of there in the structure of the novel as well, right? Like complementary perspectives, or like different perspectives, both in terms of the two planets, but also I think you're meant to take a different perspective. You can see different perspectives on the way that the society is structured. Like it encourages you to see.
Yeah, totally. So, actually, so there's another thing I wanted to say, and that is that Jekyll in his paper, he also talks about, so his thing is complementarity, right? So he says that sequency and simultaneity are complementary, but in the same way, as a parallel in the novel, bringing these two things together, that is also mirrored in Shevik wanting to bring together two other ideas, and that's the idea of individual freedom and social responsibility within the anarchist system of Anarres. So these are two things that he's kind of struggling with at the same time, these two ideas within physics, but then also these two ideas within how Anarres is run as a society, where he kind of constantly is, he's defending the way that it's run. He wants to live his life at the service of the community, but at the same time he keeps being ostracized because he's doing things differently. And even within this utopia where there's not meant to be any hierarchy, there are always people who are kind of in his way and that just aren't even particularly interested in his work. And so there's his individual freedom is not really given enough space, and he's kind of thinking about how it's even possible to have this individual freedom but also the social responsibility.
Yeah, sure, because he definitely doesn't want to like lose that collective aspect. But
yeah, absolutely. So he's kind of trying to unify these two things. But so in the same way that you can see time as both linear and cyclical, you can also see this question of individual freedom versus social responsibility, this is what Jekyll says, as also having two aspects that you can understand at the same time. So there's the moral one. So how does a person act in complete freedom and yet for the mutual aid of others? And then there's the political one. How does an anarchist negotiate the needs both of the individual and the group? Because so if there are no laws on Anarres except for the single principle of mutual aid between individuals, and there's no government but the single principle of free association, which is what Shevik says, then how can you act in a way that is both in the interest of the group and according to your individual freedom? And how can you assure that that's what happens without being constrained yourself, or vice versa? And so then Shevik, just like he has this breakthrough with the general temporal theory of seeing time as two things at once, he also has this breakthrough of seeing individual freedom as actually vital to fulfilling one's social obligation. So there's this bit where he says he suddenly recognized that need to be himself in Adonian terms as his cellular function, the analogic term for the individual's individuality, the work he can do best, therefore his best contribution to society. A healthy society would let him exercise that optimum function freely, For though only the society could give security and stability, only the individual, the person, had the power of moral choice, the power of change, the essential function of life. The Odonian society was conceived as a permanent revolution, and revolution begins in the thinking mind. So again, there's this, if you look at it as a complex system, Odonian society in this case, then you need to have this openness for change that occurs naturally and organically within the system, and you need to give it the space to thrive and to naturally enter into feedback relations with other elements in the system. And again, Shevik is kind of personifying this impulse for change and newness and growth within the system. So he just happens to be a point at which the system could change in a good way, but the system itself has to be open to that. Like, it needs to listen to him. It needs to let him do his thing, because that's what he's good at, because that's his role within the society. So at certain points, it seems like the society is trying to exclude him because he's doing things differently, but really, he is part of what makes the society work, ideally. So that's kind of what he's trying to do, is to be an agent of change within the system and to push the boundaries of the system so that ultimately everyone can benefit from his work. So, ultimately what he comes back with, what his work leads to, is the development of the Ansible for instantaneous communication that's faster than the speed of light. And that is something that will then benefit not only his world, but all known worlds. And that's a massive gift that he's giving back. And that is a utopian outgrowth, again, in terms of the emergence of the genuinely new, that came from his work, that in itself came from his background as a member of this Odonian anarchist society. But it could only be realized because he was able to do his work within the system to fulfill his organic cellular function, as he says. So that in itself is very important for the system to actually function at all, to have that dynamism again.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And even the question of whether his society is up to that, even though it does have hostility, ultimately the way it's structured means it can't stop him, when he decides to go to Anarres, because there's no authority to say, no, you're not allowed. Ultimately he can do, even though he faces hostility and it is difficult, the society, because of the way it's structured, does allow him to push through that. Yeah, no, absolutely. And all they can do is, follow him to the spaceport and throw rocks at him, but they can't actually stop him from going. And and there's also, just wanted to say that Jekyll as well, even though he doesn't think of things in terms of complexity, but I think, it works really well with his idea of complementarity. But so he does say that that Shevik's general theory of time does also support the complementarity of his view of anarchy, in that he sees the act of promising as a way to believe in the flow of time and and also the reality of all different times at any given point. And there's this nice quote. Sorry, 1 second. Like we were saying earlier, that there's this promise at the heart of Odonian society, and this kind of promise to look out for the community. And it says here, Odo came to see the promise, the pledge, the idea of fidelity as essential in the complexity of freedom. So again, there's this word complexity, which is nice. And so there's this promise to always return to the founding principles of Anarres in that way. And so what Jekyll says is that promising is, by promising, you believe in the past and you believe in the future. And for the duration of the promise, you believe in the present. So you need to have basically a four-dimensional view of reality in order to believe in the promise that underlies Anarres. So Odo says that, that you have to keep returning to these founding principles. But then there's this other nice quote that's, you can go home again so long as you understand that home is a place where you have never been. So because everything is constantly ideally renewing itself, if you give this complex system the space to be dynamic and to renew itself, then even if you do come back to this basic promise of how it's meant to be, of how you've laid it out so that it's at the service of the community, it'll still not necessarily look the way that you expected it to look, because it's constantly changing.
And also, just in terms of four-dimensionality, Shevek actually mentions Einstein, or he's called Einstein in the language that they use. But so he talks. So when he's developing his general theory of time, he is helped by the fact that he looks at Einstein's work and he realizes that Einstein actually failed to prove his unified field theory. And in the same way, Shevek then decides to not even try to prove the hypothesis of the coexistence of sequency and simultaneity, but instead to just assume that they coexist, which is then this complementarity. So Einstein actually is an important impulse for him to make his final mental leap in developing his theory, his unified theory. But also, what's interesting is that an Einsteinian worldview, in fact, presupposes four-dimensionality, and so does Shevek's general temporal theory, because you need to. So, in order to have this cyclicality of time, you need to assume that that all time is equally real at any point. And so he actually also says to the Terran ambassador later on, "You don't understand what time is." So she's saying that she's come from Terra, which is now ruined, and they don't have any hope for the future, and all they can really see is, how much better Eurus is, because it's kind of like how Terra used to be, in that it was, it's a, super capitalist exploitative society, but at least it hasn't destroyed itself, right? So she's going back to the past. But what he says to her, and she's saying, like, the idea of Anarres means nothing to the people of Terra, because they just can't even imagine having a society that's so different. It seems so far in the future to them that they can't even engage with it. All they can imagine is maybe going back to their own past. But then what he says to her is, "You don't understand what time is. You say the past is gone, the future is not real, there is no change, no hope. You think Anarres is a future that cannot be reached, as your past cannot be changed." And then he says, "But you can't even have the present unless you accept with it the past and the future." So again, just this coexistence of all times as kind of essential to having any kind of forward movement. Even, like, you can only really, so in his mind, you can only really move towards a future if you acknowledge that the present and the past exist, and but that they all come together in certain ways to create reality and to make reality in itself malleable.
I'll avoid going off on too much of a tangent, but perhaps ties in nicely. I don't know if the two quite go together, but I don't know if you're particularly familiar with Frederick Jameson, but he obviously has this idea that kind of the problem with politics today, or like the way society is structured, is it's lost this idea of history. Like the anti-utopian impulse we have is like a fundamentally like anti-historical one. Like we need like a concept of history to be able to think utopia. So I don't know, perhaps ties in a bit.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's also one reason why The Dispossessed and also a couple other novels are critical utopias, in that they don't just look towards the future. They don't just look towards what could be different. They actually look towards what needs to be different, and for that you need to look at the present. But they also have the courage to look back at our own past and also like not only see what went wrong there, what traps we could fall into again, but also try and understand our past differently in terms of just employing different viewpoints. So, for example, if you're trying to create a society that's better for everyone, then you might be looking at the past in terms of social change that was created not just by the people who were in charge, but also just like how communities have worked together at different points in time, and also marginalized communities. And so basically you're reinterpreting the past while you're using the present to create a better future, right? So again, it's like all of these times have to exist in your mind for you to create something that's like genuinely better or worth working with. So absolutely, like history is important, the present is important, the future is important. You can't isolate any of those and still have any kind of sustainability.
So that is the end of part 1 of this conversation on The Dispossessed. Part 2 will be out, let's say, a week at the most. I might release it sooner, I don't know. But yeah, in that second part, we'll discuss some more stuff like we hinted in this bit. You may have noticed that we kept talking about how things are supposed to work in principle and how there might be some complications in that. Well, we'll return to that and talk about imperfection in utopia and what the value of that might be. We'll talk a bit about use of perspective, estrangement, and some other bits. So please come back to that second part. Again, one more time, please think about checking out the Patreon at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons to help me make this podcast more sustainable and keep it coming out regularly. If you can't afford to or don't want to support me on the Patreon, an iTunes review would be appreciated as well. If you've got any questions, either about stuff like the Patreon or just general things about the episodes, questions about stuff I've covered, things you think I might have missed, anything like that, you can get in touch at utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com. You can find the Twitter at Utopian Horizons, and there's a Facebook page at facebook.com/Utopian Horizons. So thank you for listening, and I will be back soon with lots more stuff.